It's a Wednesday afternoon. You're at your desk, maybe during lunch, and you're reading something about taxes. You're not sure why, maybe a news story, maybe a comment someone left somewhere, but you've gone down this small rabbit hole about how much tax wealthy people actually pay. And you're reading these numbers and something feels off. Not in a conspiratorial way, just mathematically. Like the percentages don't add up to what you'd expect. Because you pay income tax on your salary. Every paycheck, before you see a cent, that money is already gone. Federal, state, FICA, you have no choice, no timing, no strategy. You earn it and it gets taxed. That's how it works for you. And then you're reading about people who have, say, $30 million in stock holdings in a company they founded. And they're living very well. Nice houses, nice cars, nice everything. And their income tax bill for the year is modest, suspiciously modest for the lifestyle they're living. And at first you think, okay, accountants, tax lawyers, some loophole, some fancy thing that requires a team of expensive professionals and a certain kind of wealth to access. But it's actually not that. The thing they're doing is much simpler, much older, and much more interesting than a loophole. And here's the strange part. The basic version of it is actually available to anyone who understands how it works. Not the full version, not the $30 million version, but the principle itself. It's called buy, borrow, die. And once you understand it, you'll never look at wealth or your own money quite the same way. My name is Peter, and if you've ever wondered why wealthy people seem to pay proportionately less tax than you do, and whether there's any part of that logic you can actually use, subscribe before we go any further. What I'm about to walk through is one of the most structurally important ideas in personal finance, and it's almost never explained in plain language. Let's fix that. Let's start with how most people's relationship with money actually works, because you have to understand the baseline before the contrast makes sense. You earn a salary, let's say $64,000 a year. Before that money reaches you, taxes come out. Federal income tax, state income tax if your state has it, Social Security, Medicare. Depending on where you live, you're losing somewhere between 25% and 28% of that gross number. So $64,000 becomes roughly $46,000 in take-home pay. Call it $3,830 a month. From that, rent, $1,500, car payment, $370, insurance, $160, student loans, $300, utilities and phone, $175, groceries, $340. That's $2,845 in fixed monthly costs. You've got $985 left. Fine, not luxurious, but workable. Except that $985 has to cover gas, everything social, anything irregular, any clothing need, any copay, any surprise. Most months it's fine. Some months it isn't. Now let's say you've been putting $200 a month into a brokerage account for the last 4 years. You read something about index funds, you set up an automatic transfer, and you've been doing it. Your account is now worth about $11,000. Not life-changing, but it's yours. And here's where the normal person's experience and the wealthy person's experience start to diverge in a very specific, very instructive way. Let's say you need $8,000. Maybe it's a down payment on something, maybe it's a big expense. Maybe you want to consolidate some debt. You have $11,000 in that brokerage account. The obvious move, sell some of it. Take out $8,000, done. Except when you sell, you trigger a taxable event. Those investments have grown. Let's say you put in $9,600 over 4 years and it's now worth $11,000. That $1,400 in gains gets taxed. At long-term capital gains rates, if you held them over a year, which is 15% for most middle-class earners, that's a $210 tax bill. Not catastrophic, but it's money you're losing to access your own money. And you've also stopped the compounding on whatever you sold. Those shares aren't growing anymore. They're gone. That's the normal experience. Earn, get taxed, save what's left, invest some of it, sell when you need it, get taxed again. Now let's talk about why the wealthy almost never do step 5. Most people think about money as a flow. It comes in, it goes out, and somewhere in the middle you try to save some. Income minus expenses equals what's left. And when you need more, you either earn more or you sell something you have. That's the model. And it's not wrong exactly, it's just incomplete. It only describes one way of relating to assets, and it happens to be the most tax-inefficient way that exists. Here's the thing nobody really says out loud in plain language. In the United States and in most developed economies, you only owe tax on money when a taxable event occurs. When you earn a salary, taxable event. When you sell an investment for a gain, taxable event. But simply owning something that is growing in value, that is not a taxable event. It can grow for years, for decades, without triggering a single dollar of tax, until you sell. Most people's response to that is, okay, so I'll hold my investments longer before selling. And that's good advice. But the wealthy figured out something more fundamental. What if you never sold? Not as a philosophical stance, as a financial strategy. What if you could access the value of your assets, actually spend it, live on it, use it for things, without ever selling? Without ever triggering the capital gains tax, without ever stopping the compounding? That sounds impossible. It isn't. This is the actual strategy, and I want to walk through each word because they all matter. Buy. You acquire assets that grow in value over time. Stocks, index funds, real estate, a business. The specific vehicle matters less than the principle. You own something that appreciates in value. You're not spending your money. You're converting it into a growing asset. At $64,000 a year, with $985 in monthly discretionary room, this is modest. Maybe you're putting $300 a month into a low-cost index fund. That's $3,600 a year. It doesn't feel like much, but the point isn't the amount right now, it's the behavior. You are converting earned income into an asset that will grow without generating a taxable event year over year. Borrow. Here's the pivot. And this is the part that most people find genuinely surprising. When you need cash, not to fund a lifestyle you can't afford, but to access value that's already yours, instead of selling your assets and triggering a taxable event, you borrow against them. Banks and brokerages will lend you money using your investment portfolio as collateral. It's called a securities-backed loan, or sometimes a pledged asset line. The interest rate is typically much lower than a credit card, often lower than a personal loan, sometimes as low as 2 to 4% depending on the lender and market conditions. And crucially, the loan proceeds are not income. You don't pay income tax on borrowed money. So, let's go back to your $11,000 portfolio and your need for $8,000. Option 1, sell $8,000 worth of investments, pay capital gains tax on the appreciated portion, stop the compounding on those shares. Option 2, borrow $8,000 against your portfolio, pay, say, 4% interest, which is $320 a year if you hold the loan for a year. Your investments stay invested, they keep growing. The loan gets repaid over time from income or future investment proceeds. No capital gains tax triggered. None. Now, which option makes more mathematical sense depends on your specific numbers, your gain, your tax weight, your expected investment return versus the loan interest rate. For modest portfolios, the math can go either way, but as portfolios grow, the advantage of borrowing over selling compounds dramatically. At $500,000 in investments, selling to access $50,000 might trigger $7,500 or more in capital gains tax. Borrowing $50,000 at 4% costs $2,000 in interest for the year, and your investments kept compounding the whole time. Die. This is the third piece, and it's the one that makes the whole strategy complete. In the United States, there's a provision in the tax code called the step-up in basis at death. Here's what it means in plain terms. When you die and leave appreciated assets to your heirs, those assets get revalued at the current market price. The accumulated gains that built up over your lifetime, the difference between what you paid and what it's worth now, are essentially wiped from the tax ledger. Your heirs inherit the assets at today's value, not your original purchase price, and the capital gains that were never triggered during your lifetime are never triggered at all. They disappear. So the strategy, taken to its logical conclusion, works like this. You buy assets and let them grow for your entire lifetime without selling. When you need cash, you borrow against the portfolio rather than selling. You repay loans over time from income. When you die, the assets transfer to heirs with a stepped-up basis, and the lifetime of capital gains that were deferred
Never realized, never taxed, simply vanish. That's buy, borrow, die. That's how wealth compounds across generations while the tax burden stays structurally minimal.
I want to be honest here about what this costs ordinary people who don't understand the principle. Not because the full strategy is accessible to everyone right now, but because the mindset shift is. Let's say you have $40,000 in a brokerage account at age 35, and over the next 20 years you periodically sell portions of it when you need money. A car here, a home renovation there, a few life events. Every time you sell, you trigger a capital gains tax. Every time you sell, you remove shares that were compounding. Run the math on $40,000 growing at 7% annually for 20 years without interruption. It becomes about $155,000. Now run it with 4 $10,000 withdrawals at ages 35, 40, 45, and 50, each one removing shares before they compound fully. The ending number drops to somewhere around $90,000 to $100,000, depending on timing. That difference, $55,000 to $65,000, is what selling costs you. Not in taxes alone, in lost compounding, in stopping the growth engine to fund something you might have been able to borrow for at 4%. And at the scale wealthy people operate, this math is the entire game. You don't need a higher return if you never interrupt the compounding. You don't need a tax strategy if you never trigger the tax. So here's how people who understand this think differently about money. And again, not billionaires, not people with trust funds, people who've internalized this framework at any asset level and let it change how they make decisions. They don't think, I have money in this account that I can spend. They think, I have money in this account that is working, and if I need to access value, I should look for the lowest friction way to do that without stopping the work. That's a fundamental reframe of what an investment account is. Most people think of it as a savings account with better returns. Money you put in, money you take out when you need it. But the buy, borrow, die mindset treats it as a different kind of entity entirely, an asset base that is perpetually generating value and that you borrow against rather than withdraw from whenever possible. It changes specific decisions in concrete ways. You're 38, you want to replace your car. Your brokerage account has $28,000 in it. The old mindset, I could sell $15,000 from the account and buy a used car outright. That's smart. No car loan, no interest. And that reasoning isn't crazy. Eliminating a 6% car loan by selling assets feels financially savvy. But the new mindset runs the numbers differently. That $15,000 at 7% annual growth over the next 10 years becomes about $29,500. The car loan at 6% on $15,000 over 5 years costs roughly $2,400 in interest. So you're paying $2,400 to keep $15,000 in an account that grows by $14,500 over a decade. That's a net gain of about $12,000 from borrowing instead of selling, before you even factor in whether selling would have triggered capital gains. Sometimes selling is still the right answer. Sometimes the loan rate is too high or the investment gains are small enough that the math tips the other way. This isn't a rule, it's a framework for asking a different question. Instead of, can I afford to borrow? The question becomes, is it more expensive to borrow or to sell and stop compounding? That question, that mental habit, is what separates people who build assets from people who perpetually access and deplete them.
And here's what it looks like at the scale most people watching this are at. You can't do the full buy, borrow, die strategy with a $12,000 portfolio. The minimum for a securities-backed loan at most brokerages is typically $25,000 to $50,000 in eligible assets. Below that threshold, you're not borrowing against the portfolio in the traditional sense. But you can do the mindset. You can stop treating your investment account as an emergency fund that happens to be invested. You can build an actual emergency fund, 3 to 6 months of expenses in a high-yield savings account that handles the everyday surprises so the investment account never needs to be touched. You can start asking, for every major expense, is there a lower-cost way to fund this that doesn't require selling? And you can let the account grow, uninterrupted, boring as that sounds. I want to name something that might be sitting with you right now, which is this feels like a strategy for people who already have money. And there's some truth to that. The full expression of buy, borrow, die requires a portfolio large enough to borrow against meaningfully, and enough income stability to service a loan without stress. Most people watching this aren't there yet. Some of you are. Most of you are somewhere in the building phase. But here's what I'd push back on. The behavior that leads to a $500,000 portfolio starts with the behavior you have when you have $15,000. The person who learns not to sell at $15,000 is the same person who doesn't sell at $150,000. The habit of protecting the compounding engine, of finding other ways to solve short-term cash needs before reaching for the investment account, that starts now or it doesn't start. The wealthy don't sell because they learned not to sell when they didn't have to, when they had options, when they had enough buffer to handle the short term without liquidating the long term. That's the unsexy version of this whole framework. Not here's a tax strategy, more like build the buffer so you never have to sell out of urgency, and then let the math do its slow, boring, powerful thing. So here's the actual thing about buy, borrow, die. It's not really about borrowing, and it's not really about dying or estate planning or passing wealth to heirs. At its core, it's about one thing: never interrupting compounding unless you have to. The tax efficiency is real. The step up in basis is a genuine structural advantage that the wealthy have used for generations. None of that's fiction. But the part you can use right now, today, at whatever asset level you're at, is simpler than any of that. It's the decision to treat your investment account as something other than a savings account with better returns, to build the buffer that makes it so you're never forced to sell at the wrong time, to run the math before you automatically liquidate and ask, is there a less expensive way to access this value? Most people sell because selling feels like the only option. The money's in the account, you need money, you take it out. That's it. But when you understand that selling has invisible costs, not just the tax today, but the compounding that stops the moment those shares leave your account, you start looking for other paths. Not always, not dogmatically, just as a habit of asking the question first. The wealthy have been asking that question a long time. They built systems around the answer. You don't need the system yet. You need the question. And once you start asking it, you'll be surprised how often there's a better answer than sell. If you want to see exactly how selling out of urgency is just one of the many ways the average person loses 90% of their lifetime earnings, and the 50 shocking statistics that prove the math is rigged against you, click the video on your screen right now. Stop depleting your assets and start protecting your compounding. I'll see you there.